So, Dwayne, that was great. He's fielding some questions here, and we hope let's take a call later on. We hope he'll be here for lunch. I told Dwayne that forgive us for wearing suits, but that's because we're hiding our tattoos. It may be true for some of us, So it was interesting to hear him talk. I was telling Liz Gordon, who I was just teasing here with the orange shawl, that one of the, I think, outstanding examples of what Dwayne was talking about actually was what we call Caseworks at the business school, which was kind of a skunk works, was the, I think, Liz mentioned. It's very successful. It was entirely different, run by Steve Zeldis with Liz and Gordon and Ronnie Sacco. And it's been very successful. And it's something which maybe if you have time later, Liz, will come back to as a discussion point, because it's a nice success for the school, a primary success for us. We have, this is our panel for academics to discuss this issue. Academics tend to be, in their research, less holistic than when they teach. And so this is not a panel which is trying to be holistic in the sense of putting everything together. Rather, it's looking at particular approaches from three different lenses, if you wish. One is from neuroscience and psychology, which Elke Weber will discuss for us. Ray Fispin, who certainly has a holistic view on things, will be tied to the task of explaining what economics has to say. And then we imported Joe Porak from NYU to talk about the point of view from sociology and management. There are, Joe, other people in Columbia who could talk about this, but you represent for many of us a person of such depth of knowledge and passion that we wanted to bring you in for this occasion. And maybe it's also in the spirit of what Dwayne was saying, that partnering not only within the schools but across schools is a great way to have change occur. Each one's to speak for about 12, 13, 14 minutes, and then we'll go through all three of them, and then we'll take some questions. Thanks very much. Elke, please come up.
All right. Thank you so much, Bruce, for the introduction. I will present to you from my perspective, which is a researcher in psychology and in the neurosciences, why change is so hard. The title of my talk, If You Change It, They Will Like It, is a riff on another assertion. Oftentimes you see it in movies. If you build it, they will come. And as you know, that assertion isn't always true. Just simply providing people with a technological or with a procedural innovation doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be adopted. So I think it's better to phrase this as a question: if you build it, will they come? And what we will do in the next 10 minutes or so is to explore some of the psychological hurdles that we have against change, against adopting things that we rationally know really would be in our best self-interest in the long run. So why is change so difficult? Well, first of all, change is scary. It involves uncertainties, and we tend to be risk-averse. Change also is hard. The costs are upfront, and for sure, the benefits come down the road, and as we said, are somewhat uncertain. So it might, at some level, be rational to be skeptical about change. As a result of that, we basically have developed this knee-jerk reaction to reject change. So that's our automatic response, and to basically mitigates against it. To decide for change requires effort, requires willpower. What do we mean by willpower? Well, there are some beautiful experiments on the availability and the consequences of willpower. Many of you probably have heard about the marshmallow studies. that Walter Mischel, who's a psychologist here, who was at Stanford at the time, conducted in the 1970s. So you see these preschoolers, you know, sitting at a table in a kindergarten setting, and the experimenter in the lab coat says, well, you can have this one marshmallow that's right in front of you, but I'm going to go away and have to check on something else. If I come back and you haven't eaten that one marshmallow yet, I'm not going to give you a second one. You're going to get two if you wait. Some kids wait, and some kids basically eat the marshmallow the minute the man goes out of the room. Now, what's really interesting, recently in the last 4 or 5 years, Walter Mischel and his team has revisited these kids. You know, so the kids that waited for the second marshmallow, and the kids who gave into their impulse and ate the first marshmallow right away. The consequences or the differences between those two groups are really astounding. So people who are willing to wait when they're 6 or 7 years old for the second marshmallow are healthier, they're happier, and they're wealthier. You know, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of earning powers, there's no question that having a greater ability to wait pays off in the long run. We know also at this point in time where willpower lives in the brain. It's right here under your temples. Make sure to wear a helmet when you go bicycling. You don't want to lose those areas. When you actually, we also have the technology now to temporarily disrupt those areas. You know, something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we do this in our lab, either on the left or on the right-hand side. For 20 minutes, just applying an impulse, an electric impulse to that side. For 20 minutes, you lose your ability to use your willpower on either side. People become more impulsive. People are less willing to embrace change. Okay, so we need willpower. Turns out that, you know, by virtue of a genetic gift, some people have bigger brain bundles that go from that area, you know, to the rest of your brain. They're more able to resist temptation. And that's actually sort of hard to change. It comes as part of our wiring. Now, fortunately, that's not where the story ends. The situation, the power of situation is also very important. In other words, there are ways of changing decision situations for people in a way that require less willpower to embrace change. Yeah? Some people talk about this these days as a choice architecture. It's basically a redesign of the choice situation, the decision situations, in a way that require people to expend less effort, less willpower to embrace change. So let's talk about that a little bit. There are a variety of psychological theories that provide you with tools for choice architecture. I'm going to talk about one that we developed in our lab together with Eric Johnson, which is called query theory. And so query theory is a framework that explains how people decide between one course of action, which might be stick with the status quo, and another course of action, which might be to embrace this new opportunity, this technological innovation or this procedural innovation. How do we make that decision? Well, query theory shows that it's an implicit and completely automatic process of arguing with yourself. You basically query your past experience about what's good about option A, the status quo, what's good about option B, change, and whichever query provides you with more evidence, whichever way the scale bends, this is the one you're going to embrace. And I said it's not conscious, it's not explicit, it's completely implicit, but it's the querying process itself is sequential. We first ask one query, we then ask the other query, and the order in which we ask ourselves implicitly, what should I do, A or B, matters tremendously, because all other things being equal, we generate more arguments for the first query. Yeah, there are a variety of explanations. I don't necessarily have to go into it, but one way to think about it is, as you think about what's good about A, there might be some answers, some arguments for B, and you tell them, okay, not quite yet, I'll get to you in a second. You temporarily inhibit those. But then as you turn to the second or third query, they have a harder time coming up to the surface. Yeah? And so the balance of evidence is always in favor of the first query. Now, of course, that now provides you with a million-dollar question. Which option, which choice options gets considered first? Yeah, that's sort of the recipe also for intervention. You know, there are many answers to that question, but the most important answer, and the most prevalent answer, is definitely the status quo. Now, you all know we all stick in the mud. So we don't like to change that software update. Status quo bias is prevalent at the individual level, at the corporate level, at the social level. And one big contributor to that is basically that we first think about arguments for the status quo. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we probably had very good reasons to engage in what we're doing to start with. We've been doing it for a while. It hasn't killed us yet, so it can't be all that dangerous. So there's a certain reasonableness to thinking first about the status quo. But of course, sometimes it also gets us stuck in a situation where we could be doing better because better options are on the table. So if that is a sort of causal factor in the status quo bias, then we should be able to also use it as an intervention. Right? And so if it's the order in which we issue queries, then focusing people first on the other alternatives, the non-status quo options, should help. And again, we show in our lab that that makes a difference. Asking people explicitly to first think about the change option helps, and we can show that that actually generates more arguments for the change. Some of the other interventions that we heard about earlier today, making the change option sexy, giving it an attractive label, giving it a beautiful design helps, because these other features, emotionally appealing exterior, attracts our attention just as much as being the status quo. So there are other factors that play into what people consider first, and we can use those as design elements to make these change options more attention attracting and therefore being considered first, and therefore generating more support, all other things being equal. Now, another thing we can do is we can impose a new status quo on people. Yeah? And so if the status quo gets considered first, that works against us when the status quo is the old option. But if we take the old option away from people and impose a new status quo, over time, that new status quo will also be considered first. And so we can do that in a variety of ways. We can do it the hard way. We can legislate away the old option. Germany did this 2 or 3 years ago in the context of lighting technology. Yeah? So incandescent bulbs became illegal, and CFLs were the only ones available. The disadvantage is that people start hoarding. And also, depending on sort of the cultural environment you're in, mandated solutions aren't always available to you. There's soft ways of making a new option, the new status quo. These nudges you've been reading about, there was a book by Sunstein and Thaler, for example, talks about making new options the default. In the context of organ donations, for example, some countries have switched from being opt-in countries, where you're not a donor unless you declare otherwise, to opt-out countries, where you are a donor unless you declare otherwise. Makes a huge difference, not just in terms of willingness to being a donor, but also in actual transplantation rates. Yeah? And so that makes a big difference. But one thing we can ask ourselves is, when there is some sort of mandate to change, will preferences actually follow the new status quo against initial public opposition? And so in the last couple of years, we've done a couple of media analysis on 2 policies that had initially been quite controversial and generated a lot of negative reactions. The 2002 New York City smoking ban that Mayor Bloomberg imposed in all public buildings, including bars. And also in Canada in 2008, the British Columbia government introduced a carbon tax. It was revenue neutral, but again, there was a lot of public opposition against that initially. And so what we've done for both of these policies, we've done media analysis in local newspapers in the area, looking at all articles that have some reference to that particular policy from the time of announcement of the policy to 2 or 3 years after it actually became implemented. So for each article, you can look at the number of arguments, or look at each argument coded as a pro argument, as a con argument, and then for each time period, look at the relative balance. Is it more pro, which means it's above the dotted line in the upper side of the graph? Is it more con in the lower part? And as you can see, at time of announcement on the very left-hand side, support plummets. It becomes net negative until implementation. At the very bottom, at implementation, it starts to increase. At some point, it becomes net positive again. So that's essentially sort of, if you want to say, at the point in time at which public opinion has adopted the new status quo, starts generating arguments for it first, okay, and therefore, by virtue of sort of arguing for it first, looking for evidence for it first, generates more support. Now, there are many, many other explanations for that. Yeah, this is just one of the contributing causes. But one thing that's interesting is, how long does it take? Because if you are the corporate or public policymaker who sticks out his or her neck to do something that actually is quite unpopular, you want to know by which time can I actually think about re-election or promotion. Turns out in the case of the New York smoking ban, that was 14 months. In the case of the BC carbon tax, it was 8 to 9 months, and the premier actually did get re-elected. So in conclusion, I think sort of you see that, yes, sort of you should expect opposition to any kind of change in the status quo. It's human nature to not embrace wholeheartedly change right away, and there are lots of good reasons for that. Okay? However, when sort of you or your team have decided that it actually is increasing corporate or public welfare to change to a different policy, to some extent, you shouldn't be paying too much attention to public opinion or the opinion of the people who have to implement it, because you can expect them to be opposed to it. Sometimes it helps to be paternalistic or maternalistic and just impose the change, because if you change it, they will like it if the policy actually does increase public or corporate welfare. First of all, people will experience it after the change, but also more importantly, perhaps, or equally importantly, they will now think about the new change as a new status quo, and therefore think about it in different ways. People or policymakers should be leaders rather than followers of public opinion. And I think sort of these examples and perhaps sort of other analysis of the sort will show us sort of what the timing of these change initiatives ought to be so that you actually can sort of live after the fact despite the initial opposition to it. Now, more importantly, I hope I showed you that behavioral sciences have an important third leg in the change process. Yes, we do need technological innovation, and yes, we do need to have the right incentives in place. The policy has to be showing itself to be cost-benefit positive and so on. But you also need to know how people think about, first of all, new technology or sort of new procedures, and putting to use the instruments that come out of understanding better how people think about that, putting to use the tools of choice architecture can help you implement both technological innovation and incentives in a much more effective way to help your organization or yourself in a private context achieve your long-term objectives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm going to move back in time several thousand years because I'm going to use, whoops, so, go through. Change the view, okay, hold on, okay, sorry, Ray. I'm going to be talking about the relationship between imagination and organization. And I titled my brief talk, Imagination and its Organizational Discontents, and I'll explain the title at the end. But I want to go back to the ancients, and for a couple of reasons. One, it's always fun to kind of get out of your current situation and think about the past, but I guess underlying my discussion today is an argument that the reason why it's so difficult to change organizations has to do with a fundamental tension that exists in the human condition and has for many thousands of years. And I want to just talk a little bit about this tension and kind of explore it a little bit. And I want to go back to the Paleolithic era in human evolution. And I've been reading a lot about cognitive archaeology these days, and it's really amazing what this interdisciplinary field has unearthed. And our ancestors started to use tools about 2.5 million years ago. So says the archaeological evidence, mainly stone tools. And for about 2 million years, there was very little technological change. So these are early tools, and the middle are sort of the tools that eventually evolved, and these kind of are just chips of stone that were used to kind of maybe carve bone or something. And eventually, people began to shape. Our ancestors began to actually shape tools for certain purposes, but there's not a whole lot of change. And so think about that. I mean, in the grand scheme of evolution, 8 billion years or something, 2 million years is not a lot of time, but in human evolution, 2 million years is quite a long time to have very little technological change. And the archaeological record shows that around, well, there's a little bit of debate, around 100,000, 50,000 years ago, give or take a few thousands of years, there was literally an explosion of new technologies, not just stone, but bone and wood and other kinds of things. And actually, a manipulation of shapes for specific purposes. And this is kind of a discontinuous technological development, as archaeologists have concluded. And the question is, what happened? And much of the current thinking is kind of one of the great questions of human existence, but cognitive archaeologists and neuroarchaeologists have begun to kind of suggest that what happened was a possible mutation in the brain that allowed for expanded working memory capacity. And it expanded working memory capacity to the extent that some, for example, the neuropsychologist Michael Corballis suggests that the change was an increased ability to embed mental representations within mental representations to construct complex thoughts. And then from that, language and so on and so forth. And this has been known as the Upper Paleolithic explosion. And from 50,000 years ago to now, you see this inexorable march of technological change and an inexorable increase in human population on Earth. And so much so that there's been so much change that you kind of think, well, why are we here talking about why change is so difficult? Because, in fact, if you believe in futurists and so on, not only has there been remarkable technological change over the course of human existence, but at least in the last 50,000 years, but it's increasing. And so that's kind of an interesting thought on one side of the story, that in fact, we're very capable of creating all sorts of new innovations. But the second side of the story, I want to go back, I want to fast forward from 50,000 years to maybe 4,000 years ago and talk about the pyramid at Giza, which for thousands of years was the largest man-made structure on Earth. Current estimates suggest that it took about somewhere, there's controversy, between 10 and 30,000 years ago, 10 and 30,000 workers, between 10 and 30,000 workers, about between 20 and 30 years to build, and it was completed around 2560 BC. Now just think about that. Let's round it off. 20,000 workers, 20 years to build. And we're not talking about multiple different products, we're talking about one thing. And the amount of focus and commitment and energy to get 20,000 people to build one thing over 20 years is a remarkable achievement. And architects and construction engineers even today marvel at this achievement and clearly see it as one of the great wonders of the world. But although this might be an incredible achievement, the real achievement behind the pyramid is the social organization, the bureaucratic organization that was used to get these 20,000 workers to create a common purpose and focus their attention on this task. And I don't expect you to see this, but an organizational theorist by the name of Ezemel went back into the papyrus records of Egypt and recorded the bureaucratic record keeping, or analyzed the bureaucratic record keeping of ancient Egypt, and found that it was remarkable. It could come out of PeopleSoft software today, that you have detailed records of individuals, how much time they spent, their job titles, and in fact, how many daily units of beer they should have gotten for their work, because the workers were paid in bread and beer. And this bureaucratic organization is interesting because, and it's an interesting jumping off point, because one of the great organizational theorists in history, Max Weber, was fascinated with Egyptian bureaucracy, thought that it was a precursor to a lot of modern organizational forms. And he began and used it as a jumping off point to write about bureaucracy. And this is a quote from his book, Economy and Society, that bureaucracy is an incredible human invention. It's precision, speed, unambiguity, knowledge of the files, continuity, discretion, unity, strict subordination, et cetera, et cetera. This machine bureaucracy actually is in large part responsible for large-scale projects like the Great Pyramid of Giza, or large-scale projects like any large-scale organization that we see today. So And it's this bureaucratic precision and focus and commitment that is responsible for a lot of human evolution, or at least a lot of the developments in the last 10,000 years or so. So where does this put us? Well, it puts us in, I think, a fundamental tension when it comes to understanding the relationship between creativity and organization. It's a fundamental tension. The tension between possibilities and divergent thinking, and the necessity of realizing possibilities in projects that require commitment and focus, sometimes massive commitment, massive focus. Gerald Edelman, the neuroscientist, Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, wrote this wonderful book, Wider Than the Sky, about human consciousness, and he talks about, and he states in the book, the human brain is the most complicated material object in the known universe, and what that allows us to do, this wonderful device that we have in our heads, is generate all kinds of possibilities. And I think IDEO has been really successful in showing us how you can even amp that up through a variety of organizational means, generating possibility after possibility after possibility. But, and this is where imagination and innovation come from. And it seems to be a part of our prehistory, in fact. But at some point, a possibility has to be chosen, and it has to be implemented. For it to be implemented requires some kind of project or organization. And depending upon the size of that possibility, the size of what we've imagined, it could be a major commitment of 20,000 people over 20 years, let's say. And that requires focus and commitment. And so the underlying tension I'd like to leave you with is that organization, by definition, requires sustaining commitments over time. And they're not built to change, really. I mean, they're built to realize and to commit and to focus. And there'll always be a source of some constraint as we continue to imagine new possibilities and new realities, and maybe try to get those same organizations to enact them. It doesn't mean that this is not a manageable task. In some ways, it's the essence of leadership. It's the essence of creative organization. But the tension is always there and has been for many, many years. So the title of my talk, Imagination and Its Organizational Discontents, is a play on Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, where kind of argued that civilization is a creation of the human mind to protect itself from the desires, the irrational desires and imaginations that the human mind can generate. And in some ways, organizations, I see them as very similar. They are devices to focus and to build and to enact possibilities that we generatively and imaginatively create. So that's what
I think you already all know what I'm about to talk about because we just flipped through the whole thing. Don't worry, that's part of culture. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. I think that you could legitimately question what is it that economists have to tell us about culture, because economics is a famously under-socialized discipline, and we think about culture as being fundamentally social in nature. I will concede the point up front, but then also argue that the profession has moved beyond that somewhat. So I want to start out actually with the straw man, which is not such a straw man of economics, which is actually the second bullet point. I'll get to the definition of a more nuanced economic definition of culture in a second. But when you ask an economist, a card-carrying member of the American Economic Association, what culture is, you will, with frequency, get an answer that sounds as wonky as this. Culture is about trigger strategies, right? So a trigger strategy is this notion in game theory that we cooperate. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, until I see you screw me. And then for the rest of history, I just don't trust you anymore. So culture is this set of mutual beliefs that we're in this cooperative equilibrium. And it's sustained by the threat of punishment. This is a very narrowly, square-headedly rational view on human behavior. So I do think that there is some merit to this. Like, we do think of the bond trading floor at Lehman as being the post-trigger the enforcement, if you like, aftermath, the untrusting equilibrium where everyone's just out for themselves, and you would contrast that with what most of us would think of as a well-functioning culture. I'm going to broaden this and then really focus on the last part of the first bullet point. So this is taken from, I think, a fantastic paper, and the rare academic paper that is worth reading in its entirety, in its original form. It is totally entertaining, as I hope I'll convey in a second. Culture tells us how to behave when we don't have formal contractual arrangements, to tell us what to do. So it's part conscience. I know I don't screw you because that's just not the right thing to do. It's part commitment. That is, there's a certain way of doing things that we all understand is the right way of doing things, even though we can't quite codify this in a contract. And it partly is to do away with frictions around my driving on the right and you driving on the left. That is, we know how to, it reduces frictions in how we interact. Now, I should say this definition does sort of take as its departure the observation in the economics of organizations that we cannot govern our lives with a complete rule book, a complete codified rule book. That is, I cannot write a contract that fully describes what I do at Columbia Business School. There will always be some residual ambiguity, and these informal agreements fill in these interstitial spaces, if you like, between what formal agreements provide. So just a couple of examples that I kind of like. These are both from Bob Gibbons, who's an eminent organizations economist. He has this paper on Merck with Rebecca Henderson, where they use the efforts of Merck to change to being a more research-driven organization. That they were telling new hires, this is almost like a university job. Define that for me. Tell me what almost means. Well, I learn what almost means by observing what goes on around me, by how often the bean counter noses his way into my lab and tells me I better watch expenses. The number of times he tells me, you know, you really can't go to that conference. The number of times he tells me, where's the next marketable product in the pipeline? And just as a side note as well, something that Gibbons likes to talk about is the way we really learn about what an organization stands for are these cases where the organization is about to implode, and you know what, it might implode if we stick to our principles, but we do it anyway. Because otherwise it's just kind of cheap talk. But you know, firing a very profitable trader, for example, who happens to be not a nice person. Other people use a different word to describe this. That's an example of showing a credible commitment to this. Now, what I mostly, this was meant to be animated, so I'll just tell you what lies behind the P&G and Gillette picture. Mostly what I want to talk about is a few minutes on thinking about culture as coordination. So if you think about an organization as having all these complicated, interconnected, moving parts, and you're thinking about moving from one way of doing things to another way of doing things, this is a complicated and fraught process where we can't like change one thing here and then another thing here, because sometimes if you change one thing here or have one person change the way he's doing things without someone else doing the same thing at the same time, the whole thing falls apart. So just some very simple unidimensional examples of what I mean by this. The wording behind there that starts with kiss, you know, kiss, bow, or, you know, it's a little embarrassing if you go to Japan and you give big wet kisses to everyone you meet. The cars over there, that is a picture from the first day that Samoa shifted from driving on the right to driving on the left. and people forecast that this would be Armageddon. This is sort of going to some of the earlier comments about, this is really hard. This change is hard. This is the easiest thing in the world. They've had months to prepare for this. Enormous publicity campaign, and still people thought the world was going to end that morning when they switched from driving on the right to driving on the left. And the final example that I like of this is you have this synergistic merger between P&G and Gillette. One of the problems they confronted is at P&G there was a meeting culture, and this had manifested itself in very tangible ways. They had a lot of meeting rooms, versus Gillette, which communication was dominantly via memos. So they had a better IT system for communicating in written form. You now bring these two cultures together. How do you shift them to a new way of communicating amongst themselves? So I want to give one example of what I think, this is the super entertaining article that I was referencing earlier by Colin Kemmer and Roberto Weber, which I think serves as kind of a nice metaphor for the challenges of coordination in a very simple, stripped-down context. And also just, unless you do something to manage the way people feel about this process, it's clear that they end up disappointed, angry, frustrated. So the experiment is as follows. Two people are sitting in a lab. They're partners. Each sees a matrix of pictures. There are some similarities amongst the pictures that will make it a little challenging to identify each one. One person has these pictures labeled 1 through 9. And they get compensated by, based on how quickly the so-called manager, the one who's doing the describing, gets the worker to click sequentially on pictures 1 through 9. Okay, so they have to communicate. They have to find a language to convey which picture is number 1 and so forth. So not surprising. Uh-oh. So this is sufficiently problematic that I'm actually going to delete this so you can see the pictures that I hope are behind here. If they're not, we'll just continue, and I'll tell you that there are some fantastically entertaining pictures. Oh, okay, so there are some fantastically entertaining pictures in this paper. One of them, they're all from a workplace. So we can do this without the pictures, but I encourage you to look up the paper. One of them, there's a bunch of cubicles. One of them, there's an Indian guy in the foreground. And in thinking about the difficulties in communicating across, you can think about this as kind of being like we're trying to get the Italians to listen to the Japanese. One group came upon as the shorthand for this picture, Uday Rao. If I showed you this picture, or showed you a bunch of pictures and told you to click on Uday Rao, you would obviously not have any clue what I was talking about. These students happened to share a professor who looked a lot like the guy in the picture, who was named Uday Rao. Another one of the pictures has it's like an action shot of a meeting, and there's a guy like this. And another group formed a shorthand, Macarena. So again, I show you a picture of a meeting, as well as a bunch of other meetings, and I tell you, click on Macarena. You're not going to know what I'm talking about. Now, so this is not surprising. After we have a few iterations of this, we're much more fluid. We form a common language. It's easy for you to see what I'm referring to when I just say Macarena instead of giving a long description of each picture. What is probably the much more interesting piece of this is each manager now gets another employee. So half of the managers just leave the room. The other half get another employee who previously worked with another manager. So the manager and the old employee, the manager just says, click on Macarena. And the new employee is like, what the hell are you talking about? Just tell me if he looks like Uday Rao. So there are these frictions which do resolve themselves, but people are somewhat over-optimistic about the speed with which they will adjust. That is, they don't realize how much friction there will be. But I think also more interestingly, even though they adjust, and even though the manager and employee, everyone recognizes that the new employee's job is hard and harder, everyone rates him as less competent. That is, they blame the person, not the situation. So we recognize his situation is hard, but he's still an idiot. So here you see, and behind here is just some information on completion times and the fact that it took people longer than they expected, and a note on how the dim view they took of the competence of the new employee. So this is to say change is hard. Now I do want to finish on an optimistic note, and I do want to say whatever cultural dysfunction you might face, I guarantee you it pales compared to the task faced by the mayor of Bogota in 1995, who came into office facing the legacy of the Pablo Escobar years, bombs going off dozens of times a night, the highest murder rate per capita of any major city on the planet. And this is the man who transformed the culture of Bogota. And I think there are some useful lessons in thinking about equilibrium. This is not a corporate context, to say the least. But I do think there are interesting lessons to take away about culture as coordination and cultural change. So I think an important precursor to the story is that this man, Antanas Mokus, who's in his super citizen getup, came to office with a 70% vote share. Okay, so if we think about culture as coordination, everyone knows that everyone else actually wants to change. So there is common knowledge that we would like to change the way the city is run because we elected this reform-minded former rector of one of the universities in Bogota. Now, how do you go about changing the culture of the city? Again, I think in terms of thinking about culture as coordination, there are a couple of elements that are intriguing in this. So he is best known for traffic mimes. Here you have a traffic mime in action. In addition to having the highest murder rate in the world, there were also huge problems with legal compliance on every dimension, including just jaywalking. So he picked a simple, observable thing where he could demonstrate publicly that people were changing their ways. So this is not someone handing out in a private transaction parking tickets. He's making a public statement about what the right way is to do things. The second element is that they then started handing out cards with thumbs on them. So not only do I see that everyone is part of this change, I can be a part of the change myself. So if you see someone do something good, like wait for the light to change, you flash them a thumbs up. If you see someone cross against the lights, you flash them a thumbs down. This sounds ridiculous to grown-ups. If you talk to people from Bogota who lived through this, they are passionate about this stuff. And even the ones who are not passionate about the referee-style thumbs-up, thumbs-down cards, there's a broad consensus that this was the man who transformed that transformed the city of Bogota. Now, I will conclude by saying, I think a lot has been said already this morning on how we get from A to B. All I wish to observe, and I think the one insight, useful insight from economics, is that we can think about this culture as equilibrium. And once we start thinking about culture as equilibrium, it underscores a lot of the elements that must be part of this change process. I don't think the lesson that you take away from this is, oh, the best way to change an organization is to hire traffic mimes. That's some of the genius of the keynote speaker this morning, for example, is understanding what the elements are that bring about change. But I think it's useful to think about change as this shift from one equilibrium to another. So what were useful elements of this? These were public and participatory acts that actively get us from thinking about changing as a group from one way of doing things to another. So my concluding comments is, the straw man that I started with of the views that economists have on culture is a real but disappearing view among economists. I think we take a much more nuanced view of culture. I do think that we actually don't have that much to say about how we get from A to B at this point. I think that's where other disciplines are, at this point, much better suited to do the job.
Thank you very much for the presentations. And I said we have 3 research presentations on this, and I was trying to think of a common theme, and I realized there probably is one. It was Roberto Weber, it was Max Weber, and Elke Weber, I think. And amazingly how we are well coordinated in our language. So we did very well. There's a bunch of things one could add to this. I'll just say one thing is that there wasn't too much discussion about the environment, which is critical, because primarily some of these studies took place in labs, and there are probably ways to think about that, or about structures. I think Joe alluded to that when he talked about the point of an organization is to persist in doing things, and for that you need to put in place a structure. Which is more than just the individuals who actually compose it. And I think that's part of the dilemma which you were referring to in that discussion. But rather than me go on much longer, let's turn it over to you. I think we have a microphone in the, are you going to run around, Tiffany?
I'm running around.
Okay, so please ask your questions and we'll try to end on time, okay?
Hi, I'm Micah May. I'm Director of Strategy at the New York Public Library. Elke, I was intrigued by your point about the new status quo, and I immediately started wondering how we could use that. So one specific example, the New York Public Library is working on a major capital project to renovate the building where I work at 42nd and 5th, the Ghostbusters building, Stephen A. Schwarzman building. We think it's a project that will benefit the public tremendously. There will be more square footage, better square footage, but it's been mostly I mean, if you did the press analysis that you put up, it'd be mostly negative, largely because of vocal special interests who are not excited about it, including architectural preservationists and others. So your point about the new status quo made me wonder if we could do things to accelerate that, the offering of new services in that building, which would make it closer to the post-Central Library Plan offering and get the public attached to those services and the synergies they offer. And I was wondering if you've seen examples of people intentionally accelerating adoption, and if there are risks in partial rollout, for example. So, something like a capital project that takes 5 years of construction, and thinking about how that popularity curve goes, it's scary, right? You're looking at a long period of unpopularity. So
the question basically is how to speed up adoption of
yeah, have you seen examples of early rollout to accelerate the popularity of change, and are there risks in that strategy if you have looked at that?
So I think this is a really good point. I'm not so much aware of really great examples, but I think there's a trade-off, as you point out, between doing things in a way that partially gets you to the goal but might have drawbacks, as opposed to getting people to reimagine what life would be like. I think technology can help. I mean, basically, if you can't do it right away because there are structural constraints, in your case, the physical renovation, getting people to imagine what things would be like by simulations, putting people in a 3D environment where they actually experience what life would be like after the change, I think can be good. Getting people to just imagine, in role-playing exercises what things will be like. So virtually confronting them with the feedback they will be receiving after the fact can help a lot. I think also the point that many of you made earlier about the time deadlines, doing things quickly. Doing things quickly basically eliminates the opportunity for ruminating about sort of the good old days. And you have to get the job done, and that's task number one. And you have to put all your resources, intellectual and physical resources, to the change. I think, again, that's a way of sort of speeding things up in a way that also eliminates the cognitive constraints against that. So let me just finish there.
Let me just challenge that for a second on that. Maybe but the danger of that is that you don't embrace all the partners, which was talked about earlier. So there remains resistance who have not bought into it. But also the behavioral change, which you referred to and also came up in other talks too, doesn't that take time to put into place? So it's not just cognitive, but actually is the behavioral aspects which we adopt.
I mean, some of the other people might want to comment on that as well. I think I presented one facet of the organizational change problem. That's not the only one, and there are multiple objectives, and there are multiple constraints and multiple obstacles. And I think sort of the art of implementing change is to put all of these different tools and objectives together in ways that provide positive synergy rather than negative synergy. And I think that's sort of where consultants can help, because it's very hard to sort of say, well, this is the way it ought to be, because it depends very much on the context, and the context will determine how much sort of getting buy-in from multiple parties, for example, is required, how much you actually have to acquire new procedures. You can't just do it overnight. It's not just a cognitive adjustment, it's also an organizational adjustment. So of course, these things also play a role. So there's sort of no simple solution to this, but I think paying attention to how to put these tools together and then also testing them out. Not everything works in every context. Culture, of course, matters a lot. Culture sort of basically changes the chronic way in which we engage in different cognitive tools in different decision modes. Some organizations are more intuition-based, some organizations are more analysis-based, and that's going to make a difference. So I think testing these things out, doing randomized controlled trials in small subcomponents of your organization to see how these things go over is a good idea. So yeah, I think thank you for complicating the picture.
All right, I do that. That's always my contribution. Let's take some other questions in that case. We'll come back to this. Some other questions. Really?
This one, that's it.
Yes, one here.
Hi, I'm Mary Lou Ortiz. I work at Princeton University at a division called University Services. And I'd actually like to follow up on this issue of timing. The division that I work for went through a reorganization. Actually, it's still going through a reorganization right now. And the question that keeps coming up is that if there are multiple areas that would require change, is it better to do them in a shorter time period or spread them out? And I guess the arguments that have been made for doing things sort of one at a time is that staff within the organization don't have a lot of tolerance for too much change at one time. And I'm just curious to know if there's been any studies done to show that in the long run it's better to just kind of get it over with more quickly and to have multiple parts of the organization experiencing change at the same time, or is it really better to just kind of do it more sequentially so that it doesn't seem like the organization is in chaos?
Go ahead.
So I'm going to stay on message, which is to say, so if I again think about this as a coordination problem and an organization having a set of incentive systems and structures, as Bruce alluded to, as well as informal norms, that is culture, it becomes incredibly hard to tweak things one at a time or change one part without changing another. Again, the driving on the left, driving on the right serves as, I think, a useful metaphor for thinking about some of these things. I would note that in my own field of development economics, this is an absolutely divisive debate because the field has been taken over by people who run randomized controlled trials. And I don't want to say that's a good or bad thing, but that necessarily involves changing things one at a time. And I think a very reasonable response to this is how do we know if the grand total, with the sum of all changes that we would like to make, in fact, depend on a set of complementary changes? So I think that there is an argument to be made for the Mokus style of transformation, where I put up some kind of entertaining examples of cultural change. He did a lot of stuff at once, seizing the opportunity that he had coming in with a 70% vote share. And those first few months in office, he changed things, the way things operated informally, as well as I can list the formal changes that were made concurrent with them. And he very much argues that these were reinforcing changes.
Ray, let me ask you a question, Ray, on this. Gita made an allusion to this, that even though she does not necessarily believe that monetary incentives matter, she didn't quite use the word monetary, but I think that was implied. She thought perhaps it had some effect, nevertheless. So I'm curious, in your view, because I know there's the holistic Ray, and then there's the Ray of the presentation. So you can choose which persona you want to play here. But why don't you tell us how you think how effective incentives are in fostering change?
I would have to give up my American Economics Association membership card if I gave an answer other than you get what you pay for, and there is absolutely more than a kernel of truth to that. But to give a more holistic answer to you get what you pay for, on the Lehman trading floor, you got individual effort. There's a lot of group production. So the design of incentives, there are group production manifests itself in many contexts. It could manifest itself on the Lehman trading floor. I keep referencing Liar's Poker because there are lots of examples in that book of people brutally stabbing one another in the back to get more for themselves, where you see, if these guys could just play the cooperative strategy, everyone would be better off. So if your objective is to get cooperation, then of course you'd want to design incentives in a different way. If you are running a piecework shop where everyone's just running their own personal production line, I'm not sure you need a culture beyond here's $1 per windshield you fix.
So are we running a piece shop?
At Columbia.
Yeah.
Well, to state the obvious, the piecework production line is the exception rather than the rule. So if to go back to the holistic message, it is much more. You do get what you pay for. If you're trying to encourage cooperation, there's a very different set of incentives that you would give. If you're trying to encourage people to exert effort on multiple dimensions, this is very hard by just, we know what's happened when people have tried to check every box with a so-called balanced scorecard. In some domains, that seems to work pretty well, but that box you didn't check, you're going to get zero effort there, and sometimes that's what makes things explode.
Sure.
So I think the ultimate scarce resource we all have is attention. And in organizational change, you want to attract attention sort of in your corner of the universe. Incentives are a very effective way of getting attention, but they're not the only one. And oftentimes, internal motivation is much better than external motivation. And also how incentives are being institutionalized makes a big difference. So a subsidy can be very different when it's a time of purchase as opposed to as a tax return at the end of the year, because by that time you've forgotten about that. So I think sort of these things all work together, and what we need to do is to figure out how to have them work together most effectively.
Some other questions? Yes, Tiffany?
Hi, my name is Jill Corson. I'm with Parsons, the New School for Design. At Parsons, we're undergoing many changes at the same time. We've launched a campus in Paris as of this fall, and we're rolling out a new undergraduate curriculum right now. So my question is, from your three perspectives, how can the change architects, the change team, work while you're focused on your product, which in my case is delivery of education? Because many of the same people in the change team have roles in education.
Joe, I think that one's to you.
Okay.
And it's not just because you haven't spoken yet. I think it actually is to you.
Okay. Well, I think one of the, in a prior life, I spent a lot of time as an organizational change consultant and working in the bowels of organizations. And I always likened that problem to trying to rebuild an aircraft while you're in the midst of flight and trying to get from point A to point B safely. I mean, that's kind of the same sort of thing. And the organizations literature has developed all sorts of techniques, so on, to try to do this, try to manage it. I think Dwayne mentioned it a little bit in putting task forces and things like this, obvious. But in organizational theory, the term collateral organization is one technique. It could be a task force, it could be some kind of slice through the organization, getting people who have some expertise and who can take a little bit of time from their work to participate in the change process itself and to help design it and so on and so forth. But then you get into all of these time problems, right? You get into people having to do, who evaluates them? They're on the task force versus their regular boss, and you start getting into all of these issues. It's not easy, but probably some kind of parallel organization has to exist for a large-scale change like that. So, for example, at NYU, we just appointed a colleague, Adam Brandenburger, as Vice Dean of Innovation. Okay, so and to create this sort of collateral or parallel organization to process innovation or innovative ideas to try to make change happen in various bits and pieces of the organization. Now, whether that works or not creates some issues, maybe solves some others.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Serrana. I'm with Columbia Business School, and I guess I'm interested by the compressed time frame, but also the communication, how much is over-communicated, that kind of thing, and I guess also knowing your audience, since we're talking about university organization and company change.
No, I have no idea.
I think you stunned us. Maybe Joel.
Company versus university change? Or?
Right. And if you're about to throw away tenure, Joe, don't go there.
Well, anybody who's had any kind of leadership position in a university knows that the management of a university is much, I think, personally, a lot more difficult than making change happen in a corporation where there's a little bit more of a chain of command and people don't have tenure and so on and so forth. So it leads to, I think, a certain amount of inertia because of a whole variety of factors, not the least of which is that a lot of universities have been quite successful and have large groups of successful alumni who have a vested interest in maintaining where they went to school and doing what they were so successful at there. So it's tough, but I think also that there are plenty of techniques available to try to implement change even in a decentralized structure like university.
So I'm going to reference something called the CEO Time Use Project here, which is partly economics, but I think is relevant for many other domains. One of the big takeaways of that is the insane fraction of top managers' lives that are spent in meetings. And why do they spend all their time in meetings? Why was it like that back when Henry Mintzberg was doing executive time use studies in the 60s and still that way in 2013? Because this stuff around culture, these non-contractables, are stuff that I can't, by definition, I can't write a contract that describes what you're going to do in situation A or B. The only way I convey that is through the softer communication that comes via face-to-face interaction. So if there's one thing that I think this whole body of work has contributed is the need to really involve this face-to-face communication up and down the organization. And it does flow in both directions.
So Henry Mintzberg is a Canadian, which I know makes a few of you happy, including Ray, that one. Peter, speaking of Canadians, you mentioned something to me earlier about making innovation stick. Can I put you on the, could we have the microphone? Sorry, Tiffany, I can pass this over here. Okay. I'm not sure what.
I'm Peter Stringham from Young & Rubicam. In a business like ours, we have no shortage of ideas. We have far too many people who have original ideas, and when we try and enact change, it's always brilliant and wonderful until the next meeting when there's another brilliant and wonderful idea. So part of our problem is, how do you make change stick? How do you establish that status quo? Other than legislating it, and legislating creative people never works, trust me.
Want to try that now? Okay. If you can.
It's a good question. And you want to go ahead?
No.
No.
Not my department.
Some extent you're talking about a coordination issue, right? So too many good ideas, and how do you sort of decide which one to pursue? I think oftentimes coordination sort of helps or comes about because you have a common goal or have a common enemy, and so I think sort of maybe going one level further up, not just sort of looking at the level of ideas, but it's a level of questions. What question is it that needs to be solved by your organization, and at this particular point in time? Or sometimes these things can be external, something in the external environment that imposes a threat. I think part of the problem in our society right now is we have threats, or we have problems to solve that don't have these external threats, or not tangible external threats, like climate change, for example. It's very different from Hitler at the gates, or something happening on Wall Street. So I think there are a variety of maybe answers, but I think common problem or common enemy might be part of the answer.
I'll take a shot at it as well. And when I was doing change consulting, I was struck by the fact that the most fun is always coming up with possibilities. It's an endless stream, right? And then you choose one, and you try to implement it and make it a reality, and then you hit boom, right? It's sort of, and the energy kind of goes out of the room unless you manage that process. So it's a process of commitment. And turning a possibility into a reality is a committing long-term prospect. So you need to get people involved in a whole variety of ways, from the very beginning maybe. I think IDEO has really demonstrated the power of prototyping, rapid prototyping, as a role-playing exercise to get people to imagine what it would be like. Incentives certainly play a role. But if you think of it as a process of commitment, how do you build commitment to a new possibility? I think then that kind of begins to suggest ways of getting people to turn in that direction.
So we're going to conclude on this. I want to make a few comments, and then we'll take a break for lunch. Thank you, Peter, for the question and the responses. We're going to have a panel. We're going to have a speaker for lunch from the New York Public Library, as you know, talking about some of these challenges, which maybe don't echo too much all the way up in the Upper West Side, but are faculty, particularly in the ones who do historical research, are in ups and arms over the plans at the library. So there's a lot of pressure on them about where the books are going, and convincing them this is in their interests, which may take some time to do this. So we'll have a discussion around those issues, an introduction from John Coatsworth. But after that, Todd Jick is going to run an industry panel, which will broaden out basically to some of the problems which are harder for us to answer about how change is done and how does it stick, and how do you move from equilibrium A to B. I want to say something just about that real quickly. We didn't talk about some things which are probably important, which is interesting. We didn't talk about power too much, because power seems to be important to change. Or there was references earlier by Dwayne about issues of should be top down or bottom up, which seems to be really important. In fact, the Kammerer and Weber studies actually really is a bottom up process, which is so interesting to look at. And it probably depends upon the context, the environment you're actually walking into. I always, and I think universities differ on that, about how they solve these problems. So coming from an outsider to Columbia, I always saw Columbia as more of a top-down sort of organization as compared to some of the chaos of, I won't take NYU because you know that better than me, and I wouldn't want to use the word chaotic to NYU, but I'd say the Denmark School of Business often is known as more of a chaotic model of how things are done. And they both have their virtues and their problems attached to it, which are important. And I'm hoping that the afternoon discussion will address some of these things. I recently read a really good book, just the past 2 days, about a book by a guy named Sandel. You may know him from his book on justice, about what markets cannot buy, which I think is really interesting. And one of the things about that book, which is so fascinating, is the process by which you get a buy-in to something, or people have a certain belief in values, which didn't come up too much in the discussion. I know we all think about that an awful lot. But I noticed it's one of the hardest things to do at the school. I run the ethics program here, and you think that ethics would be an easy win on this, but it's hard getting faculty to agree to that ethics matters, that they should teach it, that it's a professional issue. And then what is the power of anyone to actually monitor and police this inside the classroom, and who wants to have that particular job, since we put so much emphasis upon the expertise of the individual. But one thing that Sandel says is that actually it does matter in the process itself, getting people to do it correctly. So when I looked at Ronnie earlier and I said CaseWorks on this, CaseWorks was kind of a bottom-up, and creating buy-in, but there also was a case where, a project at the school where we wanted to put in an integrated case, which did succeed very much, but it happened in a way which was kind of structured from top to bottom. It achieved the purpose, but did it create learned behaviors in terms of project teams or learning across faculty, et cetera? And probably a little bit weaker in terms of that learning process than it did in terms of actually getting the job done. But one of the nice things is I was away last year, and I came back, and the school had an entirely new face, and there was a bottom-up process put into place. And I do think a lot happened in the culture of the school, and a lot of that was because of the work that Geeta Johar did for the school. Let's take a break. We'll have lunch, and then we'll some discussion. Thank you very much.